Shut up, compressor. Hey everyone, Matt here with Dukes Models, and welcome to episode 5 of the Tamiya P-38F build. Now, in episodes 3 and 4, I pretty much got the P-38 to a point where it's ready for primer and paint. But before we can start down that path, there are still a few small things to take care of. Namely, the radio deck, the rear glass, the instrument panel coaming and windscreen and various things that go up there, turbochargers. As I mentioned at the end of episode 4, I want to go ahead and deal with the props in advance. And then there's the gear struts and the wheels and all that goodness. But for this, I want to go ahead and start with the radio deck. And I've got a whole bunch of parts laid out here. So, little headrest cushion. Here's the bulkhead behind the pilot seat. This little frame that hangs over the radio deck. The radio deck itself. The rear bulkhead. Some little bits. And some Edward resin radio components. Now I know I mentioned that I probably wasn't going to use them, but looking a bit more closely I decided, what the fuck, why not? They're a little bit more detailed, so whatever we can get. And honestly, trimming the mounting points off the radio deck wasn't all that big of a deal. So first things first with these is to get them primed, and I'm going to be using some Moto MK12. This is one of my favorite primers. In some ways, I like it more than Mr. Surfacer 1500. In some ways, it's very similar, but, you know. Alright, let's slide these out of the way, because they're going to get blown all over the place otherwise. Alright, first up, I'm going to go ahead and spray the deck. Headrest, and I'm leaving this on the sprue just because otherwise it is the kind of part that will go pinging off into some unknown region. Just having to do a couple different coats on these things just because there's no good way to hold them at all. Now with these Edward radio bits, I did go ahead and pre-drill some holes in them. It's probably very hard to see, but right in here. And my plan is to use some white Easy Line for the radio cabling. I may regret that choice. So as I've been dealing with this armor plate, I've been curious about this upper element here and what exactly it is. And the more I started looking at it, the more it looked like a canopy hinge. Like the canopy would, you know, mount to this to have it sort of positioned up and back. And so I thought I should probably check the instructions just to make sure, because I'm building an F that hinges to the side. And lo and behold, right down here, again, option B is for the F, remove it. So it's time to remove it. One of those things I'm glad I'm realizing now versus much further along the path after it's already been painted and installed and all that business. These little glass Infini files are amazing, by the way. They're great for cleaning up things like this. And now it's time to make some of these things interior green. And then for the bluer green that goes on the armor plate, I'm going to be using MRP 235 Gunship Green, which is a pretty close match to DDG and Bronze Green. Next up is a little bit of touch-up work where I need black where I sprayed green and I was just too lazy to mask. like this little box doohickey. And for this, I'm going to be using some Liquitex black acrylic ink. This stuff really simulates, at least to me it does, the look of like enameled black metal. And it has the benefit of it doesn't really move once you put it down. You don't have to worry about like little bits of it getting where it shouldn't. Okay, so I've gone ahead and glued the various radio boxes onto the frame. It's currently just placed in here on the aft radio deck. As you can see, I've installed white easy line into the various leads, and they are all sort of coming off and flowing over here. Now I need to go ahead and wrap some of these wire bundles a little bit. And honestly, I have no idea whether or not I will be able to actually show this on screen, or if I'm going to need to shut it off and kind of do it off camera, because it is super, super fiddly work. I feel like I need 6 hands for this. So we have to get enough there that we can actually work with tying it. Okay, so we got that tie made. Got the needle, get a little bit of CA on it. And just dab it like so. And once that dries, we'll come in and we'll cut that off. And that will give us a wonderful little cable tie. Now, hopefully that makes sense. Doing all these on camera is going to be a huge pain in the ass. So let me jump away, tie several more of these things, and we'll be right back. Okay, so after a lot of eye strain and expletives, I've got the radios all wired up. Now, because I went and did touch-ups to these things with Liquitex acrylic ink, I can't just move into the stencil decals. I need to put down a protective coat, because I have learned through hard experience that decal solutions attack the shit out of the Liquitex ink. Now, before I gloss the radio deck, I've got a couple things that need priming as well. So first up, we've got the Gunsight. I am fully expecting this thing to go pinging across the garage. I had hoped to hold it with the sprues, but as I was cutting it off the clear sprue, it kind of pinged away anyway. So gotta deal with what we can deal with. I typically don't like to paint clear parts with just paint. Sometimes it can't be helped. But it's always difficult getting that opacity that you want on things like a Gunsight frame. And yes, I did mask off the clear parts, so. Alright, next up I've got the remnants of the combing. So if you look at a lot of P-38 reference photos, very few of them actually have the instrument panel combing intact. But they do have this little thing that is visible through the windscreen. So basically I cut the combing off around it. And now I just need to do a little light touch up along the edges. So when I come in with the interior green up here, it'll all work. Now, I mentioned at the end of part 4 that I had ordered an Edward T-face set and it had just vanished on me. Well, literally the day after I finished saying that, guess what showed up? Like a week and a half late. So I'd been ready to write this thing off, and it was apparently not ready to write me off. Next up, we've got the rear glass. So, as you can see, the interior green is not all that opaque. And that's okay. Okay. Now, let's hot swap back to the black. So then when we look inside there, it's noticeably the darker tone. Alright, next up, it's time to go ahead and clear the radio deck with some MRP Super Clear Semi-Gloss. Ta-da! Alright, let's move on to some stencils. So these Edward decals, I'm not sure I can get the glare to catch quite right, but they've got some pretty gnarly carrier film hanging out around them, so we're going to see how they do. Alright, while these decals do their thing, let's go ahead and paint the leather pad on the armored glass. For this, I'm going to be using some AK 3rd generation leather brown. I compared it to my Vallejo leather brown, and it's a little bit browner, so I'm just going to give it a shot, see how it goes. Yeah, I think that looks pretty solid. Come in here and do a little bit of weathering before we rip all this masking off. While we're in a holding pattern with the stencil decals and the leather brown, let's go ahead and knock out the windscreen and the various canopy elements. So these have been masked both outside and inside with Edward masks. Unlike some other Edward masks I've used recently, these actually fit pretty perfectly. Nice. So for these, it's going to be interior green, then some black on the outside to seal it in. Kind of what we did with the rear glass. You can see though for sure the interior green has opacity issues over clear parts, which is why the black is so useful. Now, even if I wanted to save this till later, the armored glass has to glue in here, so this stuff has to be masked and the masking has to be removed before I can glue it in. Okay, now we're going to go back to the outside. Black primer. Get that nice darker green going on in there. Okay, so the radio equipment has been painted, it has been wired, it has been stenciled, and it has been flat coated. And now it is time for a bit of dry brushing. For this, I am using Tamiya XF20 medium gray mixed with a bit of their paint retarder. I'm not going to go with the usual buff or anything like that because I think it would be too stark. Even though stark would probably make a ton of sense given how buried this shit will be back behind the armor plating. etc. But I'm figuring it was relatively protected from the elements, probably. The back doesn't matter because it's going to be invisible. Okay, it's looking pretty sharp. Okay, next up we've got a little bit of MRP figure acrylics, charcoal gray, and black leather for the headrest. Starting with the charcoal gray and getting some lights in here. We're going to move on to the black leather for the shadow area. Looks pretty nifty. So to start off with the oils, I'm going to be using oil brushers, including dust, white. I want to fade out the that little piece that goes in the windscreen. Dusty earth, which looks very similar to dust but less saturated. How about some buff for some additional little kicks? I think with these I'm going to start with the white so that I can work on fading out this guy. Because, hey, look, the Tamiya decal is super thick. Who would have thought that? Brush it a little bit wet with thinner. Let's kind of move this into various places and break it up a bit. And as it dries, get out of here, headrest, you're fucking up the focus. As it dries, we'll come in and do a little bit of blending. Think of this a bit like the dusty combing on a car dashboard up near the windshield where it meets. You don't really dust there all that often, so you get buildup of shit and things like that, and probably the exact same thing on one of these P-38s. So that's not too shabby for a kind of dirty looking armor plate and headrest. Now we do one more thing. Just kind of let that dry. All right. Okay, now we have to face that leather pad on the front armored glass, which is currently just painted with AK 3rd generation leather brown. It's going to get a few complementary oils, namely earth clay, dark brown, and that dusty earth that we had down there already. Touch of dark brown. And there we have it. Leather. Woohoo! Okay, so this one is now ready to be denuded of its masking. And there is the armored glass with a nice little leather pad up top. We've also got the Gunsight, which got a little bit of dry brushing treatment earlier and is now also ready to be unmasked. And there's the Gunsight. Nifty. Okay, next up, it's time to get some things painted silver, starting with the props. And for this, I'm using Tamiya LP11 silver, which is my favorite silver paint in the world. This stuff sprays beautifully. It's tough as nails, which makes it great for chipping, even if it's not great as a bare metal. It's great for things that were painted silver lacquer, or again, it's great for a chipping base for aluminum and other bright metals. Now these pieces are going to put me in an awkward position of having to sort out the olive drab really fast, because I'm going to see how the olive drab sprays over the silver to possibly use that instead of going with black basing. But I also have a number of olive drab shades I'm considering for this, and so because I want the props to match the rest of the aircraft, I'm going to have to sort that out straight away. Okay, so now that the silver is down, I'm going to lay a little band of light pink around the base of the spinner. And for that I'm going to use MRP's Pale Roundel Red, which is a good light pink. And what this is going to do is provide a little bit of something for the yellow to bite onto and really build its color quickly, and not pass through the awkward greeny stage that it does over just straight silver. Alright, let's swing back around and paint the props. For this I'm using a mix of MRP tire rubber and MRP black. Get sort of a dark gray thing going on. I'm not really worrying so much about chipping up the front, because all the photos I have don't show a lot of chipping up front. All right, now comes the fun part. Come in there and I am going to sand the hell out of that. Okay, so now that the back sides are all scuffed up, it's time to go ahead and deal with the yellow on the front. Before I spray the yellow, I'm going to do a little spritz of pink. Alright, now we're loading up some MRP 142 orange yellow. Good old prop tip color. We're going to go real soft with this. Now let's go ahead and get the base of the spinner. That is a lovely, lovely yellow color. Okay, now let's go ahead and take the tape off, see what we got. yeah, looks like we got some nice prop tips up front and a lot of good North African desert wear and a braiding of the props on the back. Sweet. Okay, so I've gone ahead and masked off the banding, and I've laid down hairspray on these 4 little panels right here. This one and this one up here don't have them because honestly the yellow just extended a little bit too far, and I don't really see the utility in chipping every single piece of the prop. So now I've got some MRP 275 Russian 6K, which is a nice dark brown, to kind of reestablish a base for the olive drab. And now it's time to spray some olive drab. And I went ahead and shot a few different olive drabs on my Hellcat mule. So MRP 139, which is this early olive drab that would be on a North Africa Lightning, Guns C12, and AK olive drab number 9. And of the 3 of them, I ended up liking the Guns the most. Here you can kind of see them. So this is MRP, Guns, and AK. The AK is a really compelling color, and I think it might look really cool on armor vehicles, but I feel like it's a bit too light for where but I feel like it's a bit too light for where olive drab was during Operation Torch. If you go back here, this is Guns and AK sprayed over a darker background, because these up here are over silver basically. And I'm liking the Guns. I think it needs maybe a little bit of brown tone underneath it and maybe even mixed in, but that'll also come with the weathering. And it'll come with the brown tone layered in underneath right here. So I've gone ahead and mixed up some Guns C12. Let's go ahead and load it up and fire away. I've thinned this out quite a bit, so we should have a lot of room to play. And now that the olive drab is sprayed, it's time to do some chipping. For these, I want to focus on basically this edge between the spinner plates. More or less the same. The windscreen with a few small exceptions that we'll tour in just a minute. Okay. There we go. Add a little tiny bit more there. Now just to deal with the spinner tops. Now these are going to be interesting because I don't want to do too much to them. Okay, and one other spinner all ready to go. Alright. Always fun playing with extra thin with live paint. This is one area where Tamiya excels. And there is a nice and happy prop spinner. So we got two props looking all nice and gnarly. Now the chipping does look a little bit stark at this point, but once additional weathering goes down, that should tone down quite nicely and blend in as just war-weary prop spinners. Okay, we're coming up to the fun part of gluing the armored glass and the Gunsight into the windscreen. For this, I'm using AK's Ultra Glue. Trying to get enough on here so it will hold, but not enough that it will make a big mess. I'm going to be a complete barbarian here. And just a tiny little dab of extra thin on these. Just to make everything stay in place. That's looking pretty decent. So that fits on nicely. We're just gonna need a little bit of hand pressure to stay down. Not too bad. This piece. Now I'm not planning on installing the closed hood, but I would like to be able to use it as a mask, essentially. And you know what? I think that will just barely work. Yep. Cool. Okay, so now that all the greenhouse stuff has been placed, it's time to move on to the turbochargers. And basically all I've done here is just taken them off the sprues and placed them where they go. The loveliness of this Tamiya kit means that we can paint these things, pull them off separately, and not worry about them for quite a while until it's time to reinstall them. The only kicker is going to be this little guy right here, E3, which is going to slide off the back, which is going to be olive drab, unlike all the rest of these parts. So it is going to need separate treatment, and honestly, I will probably mount it when I go to paint the full thing. So these turbochargers are an interesting and fun challenge to paint because there's just so much going on with them. Yes, they're made out of metal, but they're also heat stained, they're also weathered, they're also, out the back here choked with their particulate stream. There's metallics, there's browns, there's blacks, there's red browns, there's tans, there's grays, there's a whole lot to cover. And I've been thinking a bit about how to best go about it, and I think I've figured out kind of a process that I'm going to follow. First of all, we're going to go ahead and hit them with a metallic. This is Moto's T024. It's a steel color. It's a little bit darker and a little bit warmer than their flat aluminum. Maybe it doesn't have quite the same surface character when it goes down as the flat stuff does, but it still looks nice. And I don't care if it looks nice because we're going to be covering it up with a whole bunch of shit. But it gives us a base to build from. And the reason I'm using this stuff instead of, say, MRP is exactly for that warm tone that it gives off, because we can use that to our advantage quite a bit. So here are our turbocharger bits. Their first coat. Let's move on to the next. Okay, now that the metallics are down, the next step is some 6K Russian brown. This is a nice dark brown that we used to base the canopy with earlier, and I think it'll look really good for the heat-stained turbochargers. Again, everything is a base until I say it's otherwise. But this stuff looked really good over metallic earlier, so hoping it can actually take us a good chunk of the way there. Check that out. Okay. Let those dry for a minute and come back around with the next phase. Okay, so now that the turbochargers have the base coat of Moto T24 and MRP 6K Russian brown on top, giving us this nice worn brown metallic patina type thing, it's time to go in and add some more colors and some more tones to really represent the way that these things tended to stain up and colorize over time. And for that, I'm bringing in essentially 3 classes of colors. So first up, we've got the browns and the reddish kind of browns. So we've got this MRP 159 chocolate, and we've got this 167 light earth, which is a great sort of almost like a light rust type color, but it definitely catches a few of the tones that you see popping out in these things in various reference photos. And this is just a dark reddish brown kind of thing, not going as far as like a whole red, but in that same family. In the middle tier, we've got some good old dark gunship gray, this sort of grimy gray color that works really well for staining pretty much anywhere. And then I'm also bringing in some very dark bluish purplish grays. So we've got eggplant dark gray, which is what you see on like the SU-34 and SU-35, or certain schemes of it, that eggplant color essentially. And I've got dark gray 36076, which is actually even darker than the eggplant. But this is the color that the Aggressor FA-18B Hornet that's done up to look like an SU-35 is painted in. And it's a very nice, again, sort of bluish purplish gray. They're both on the darker end of things, and they, I think, catch what is seen in various reference photos of how these things wear. Plus, I'm also trying to operate on the consideration that the P-38 is going to be olive drab up top. Olive drab is a fairly brownish, reddish tinted green, and because of that, if I add a bunch of reddish, brownish tinted things to the turbochargers, they might kind of blend in and get lost, and I want them to pop a little bit. So going slightly the other different direction in some areas, just to, again, pop that visual interest. First up, I'm going to be doing some of this light earth, cut down with some Mr. Rapid Thinner. So we're already getting a little bit of visual separation between these two. Alright, now we're moving on to dark gunship gray, again hit with a little shot of liquid courage in the form of Mr. Rapid Thinner. Okay, now we're moving on to this dark gray. That looks pretty legit. Let me grab. There you have it, turbocharger. And then because everything can get blown out on this white backdrop, here is the turbocharger placed into one of the booms. And as you can see, it's got a lot of life going on. And this is before any oils, before any flat coating, any of that kind of stuff, before any of the actual exhaust trail that we're going to be putting in later, which is a very light tannish grayish color, which will add a lot more life kind of back here along the top of the boom and the very back portion of the turbocharger. But still, you can see we've got the metallic tones kind of hinting through. We've got the browns and the reds, and we've got this gray-blue type stuff going on as well. So a lot of life in here. And again, once we add oils and all that kind of stuff, I think these will really pop. Okay, so I know that I said I had grand plans to tackle the wheels and the gear struts as well in this installment. However, I've run into two minor hurdles. The first is that the diameters of drill bits that I need in order to drill these out properly to mate up effectively with the gear struts, I don't have, and so I need to source them. So we're on a little bit of a wait for that. There's also the fact that based on my clip counting, this episode is already going to be one hell of an editing lift, and adding 2 more sections to it could make it kind of ridiculous. So instead of pushing things, I'm going to go ahead and call this episode a wrap with getting 3 of the things that I set out to get done. Those are the props with the yellow band around the base of the spinner, with the blades painted, with the backs abraded for the desert theater I'm serving in, all the greenhouse canopy shit, and the radio deck with the wiring installed, all that good stuff, the windscreen with the armored glass and the gunsight and the masks and the chipping, and everything is now locked down and pretty much ready for paint. And to protect everything, instead of dealing with trying to slide pieces of masking tape in around the seat and the armored glass and just making a big old mess of everything, I'm just going to use a little bit of liquid frisket and basically, come on, just drop that guy right there. A little bit of liquid frisket around the base just to hold it down, and then I'm going to put some on the outside around the fore and aft sections just to, again, protect any little overspray from diving in there and causing problems down the road. And the third thing that we knocked out, the turbochargers, which now have their base airbrush coat on. There is, again, additional weathering to come. I'm going to kind of wait until the rest of the aircraft is in a state where weathering is a thing that is happening to pull all that together. But I'm pretty jazzed with how this initial airbrushing job has come out. I think these will pop nicely against the olive drab. I think they convey a sense of wear, but not one that's necessarily super drastic. They've been flying, they are heat stained and dirty, but they are still fully functional. So with that, I'm going to call a wrap to this installment, and next time out, it will be time to prime this thing and place the HGW wet transfer rivets, which is going to be really interesting. So be sure to stick around and see how that goes. And once again, thank you all for watching. I hope you found this useful. Hope it maybe gave you some ideas for your own P-38s. And I will catch you later.